They said it would be over by Christmas. Instead, it lasted 4 years, and the men who survived wished they hadn't. World War I. When most people think about it, they picture soldiers in trenches. Maybe they've seen photos of muddy battlefields or heard about poison gas. But here's what they don't tell you about life in those trenches. This wasn't just uncomfortable. This wasn't just dangerous. This was a daily descent into a version of hell that's almost impossible to imagine if you weren't there. The trenches of World War I were where millions of men spent months or years of their lives, not fighting every day, but existing in conditions so terrible that many soldiers said they would rather be in battle than endure another day of the waiting. Because the fighting, as horrible as it was, at least meant something was happening. The rest of the time was just surviving in mud, filth, and constant fear. This is the story of what soldiers really faced in the trenches. Not the sanitized version you see in textbooks, not the heroic version you see in movies. The real version. The version that drove men insane, that gave them diseases doctors had never seen before, that made them prefer death to another week in the mud. This is what trench warfare was actually like. Let's start with the most basic thing, the trenches themselves. When you hear trench, you might picture a neat ditch with sandbags on top, maybe some wooden supports, organized and military-looking. Some trenches were like that, especially the German ones, which were better built. But most trenches, especially on the Allied side early in the war, were just holes in the ground. Ditches dug by exhausted soldiers using whatever tools they had, trying to create some protection from bullets and shells. A typical trench was about 6 to 8 feet deep and about 6 feet wide at the bottom. The sides were supposed to be reinforced with sandbags, wooden planks, or whatever materials were available. But in reality, trenches were constantly collapsing. Rain would wash away the sides. Shells would destroy the supports. Men would have to constantly rebuild and reinforce their trenches just to keep them from caving in and burying everyone alive. The bottom of the trench was supposed to have wooden duckboards, raised platforms that kept soldiers' feet out of the water and mud, but duckboards were always in short supply and would rot or get blown apart. So, most of the time, soldiers were standing or walking in mud. Not just a little mud. We're talking about mud that could be knee-deep or even waist-deep in some places. Thick, sticky mud that would suck boots right off your feet. Mud that you could drown in if you weren't careful. Mud that seemed alive, constantly trying to pull you down. This mud was unlike anything most soldiers had ever encountered. It wasn't just dirt and water, it was churned up by millions of shells, mixed with chemicals, contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and the remains of the dead. It had a consistency that was both liquid and solid at the same time. It would cling to you, get into everything, and was nearly impossible to wash off. The mud seemed to have weight, dragging at you with every step, exhausting you just from trying to move through it. The trenches weren't straight lines either. They were built in a zigzag pattern. This was for protection. If enemy soldiers got into the trench, they couldn't just shoot straight down the line and kill everyone. The zigzag meant they could only shoot a short distance before hitting a corner. It also meant that shell explosions wouldn't travel as far along the trench, but the zigzag pattern made trenches feel like a maze. Soldiers could get lost in their own trench system, especially at night or during bombardments when landmarks were destroyed. New soldiers would sometimes wander for hours trying to find their unit, getting more confused with every turn. There were different types of trenches in the system. The frontline trench was where soldiers faced the enemy. This was the most dangerous position, closest to enemy fire. Behind the frontline trench, about 50 to 100 yards back, was the support trench. This was where reserves waited to reinforce the front line or to take over if the front line was destroyed. Behind that was the reserve trench, where soldiers who weren't currently needed waited. And connecting all these trenches were communication trenches, narrow passages that ran perpendicular to the main trenches, allowing soldiers to move between the front line and the rear without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The communication trenches were particularly miserable. They were narrower than the main trenches, often barely wide enough for one man. Two men trying to pass each other would have to squeeze by. They were winding and confusing. Moving through them at night while carrying supplies was a nightmare. And because they connected the front to the rear, they were constantly in use, making them even muddier and more worn down than the main trenches. Living in these trenches meant accepting conditions that would be considered inhumane in any other context. Let's talk about the mud first, because the mud was one of the defining features of trench life, the thing that soldiers talked about most when they tried to describe their experiences. The trenches were in open ground, often in areas where the water table was high. Northern France and Belgium, where much of the Western Front was located, are naturally marshy in places. The region around Ypres was particularly bad. Rain was frequent, especially in spring and fall. And when it rained, the trenches filled with water. The drainage systems, if they existed at all, couldn't keep up. So soldiers stood in water and mud for days or weeks at a time. The mud wasn't just annoying or uncomfortable, it was dangerous and could kill you in multiple ways. Men could get stuck in mud and be unable to move when they needed to. There are accounts of soldiers sinking into mud during battles and drowning because their comrades couldn't pull them out while under fire. One soldier would reach out to help another and get stuck himself. The mud would hold you like cement, and the more you struggled, the deeper you sank. Some soldiers, wounded and unable to move on their own, sank into shell craters filled with mud and drowned slowly, crying out for help that couldn't reach them. Their bodies were never recovered, simply disappearing into the mud that became their grave. The mud was also freezing cold in winter, which led to a condition called trench foot. Trench foot happened when feet were constantly wet and cold for extended periods. The feet would swell, turn purple or blue, become numb, and start to rot. The skin would peel off. Blisters would form. In severe cases, gangrene would set in and the foot would have to be amputated. The condition was incredibly painful once sensation returned to the numb feet. Soldiers described it as feeling like their feet were on fire, being stabbed with thousands of needles. Thousands of soldiers lost feet or toes to trench foot. Some lost both feet. Officers threatened punishment for soldiers who got trench foot, claiming they had neglected their duty to care for themselves. But the reality was that in many situations, preventing trench foot was impossible. The only real prevention was to dry your feet regularly, change into dry socks, and rub whale oil or other grease on your feet to create a waterproof barrier. But in the frontline trenches, you couldn't take off your boots. You might need to move quickly, to fight, to run. Dry socks were a luxury that most soldiers didn't have. A pair of dry socks was treasure, something to be hoarded and saved for a special occasion. Dry feet were almost unheard of for men in the front lines. Later in the war, efforts were made to prevent trench foot. Soldiers were ordered to change socks daily and were given multiple pairs. Officers inspected men's feet regularly. But even with these measures, trench foot remained a serious problem throughout the war. It was just one of the many ways the trenches destroyed men's bodies. Then there were the rats. The trenches were infested with rats. Not normal rats. These were huge rats, some described as being the size of cats or small dogs. They fed on the corpses that littered the battlefield, and there were plenty of those. No man's land, the area between the opposing trenches was full of bodies that couldn't be recovered. Retrieving bodies was too dangerous in many areas. The dead just lay there, sometimes for months, rotting. The rats would feed on these bodies, grow fat and bold and numerous, then come into the trenches looking for more food. Soldiers said the rats had no fear. They would eat soldiers. Rations, if any, were left unguarded for even a moment. They would chew through packs and bags to get at food. They would crawl over sleeping soldiers at night. Men would wake up to feel rats crawling on them, sometimes dozens of rats in a single trench section. Some soldiers woke up to find rats nibbling on them, trying to eat any exposed skin, particularly targeting ears, noses, and fingers of sleeping or unconscious men. Wounded soldiers who couldn't move were particularly vulnerable. There are accounts of severely wounded men being partially eaten by rats before they could be evacuated. The rats were everywhere, constantly scurrying around, squeaking, fighting over scraps. Their eyes would glow in the darkness when a light was shone on them. The scratching and squeaking of rats was a constant background noise in the trenches. Soldiers would try to kill them, shooting them with pistols, clubbing them with shovels or sticks, setting traps, even trying to stab them with bayonets. Some units organized rat hunts, competing to see who could kill the most rats, but there were always more rats. For every one you killed, 10 more appeared. It was estimated that there were millions of rats along the Western Front. The rats bred constantly, and there was always plenty of food for them. The rats carried diseases. They carried typhus, plague, various infections that could kill. Rat bites could become infected easily in the unsanitary conditions of the trenches, and infection often meant death because medical care was primitive and antibiotics didn't exist. But there was nothing soldiers could do about the rats. Killing them was pointless. The rats were just part of life in the trenches, another horror to endure alongside everything else. Soldiers eventually became somewhat numbed to them, accepting their presence as inevitable. Then there were the lice. Every soldier had lice. It was unavoidable. Lice would infest uniforms, especially in the seams where the fabric was folded and it was warm. They would lay eggs, called nits, which would hatch into more lice. The lice would bite, sucking blood and causing constant itching and irritation. The itching was maddening, a constant distraction. Soldiers would scratch until they bled, creating sores that could become infected. Some men scratched so much they developed serious skin infections that required medical treatment. Soldiers would try to delouse themselves during rest periods, picking lice out of their uniforms one by one, or running a lit candle along the seams to burn them out. You could hear the lice pop when the heat killed them. Men would spend hours doing this, hunting through every fold of fabric, killing every louse and nit they could find. But it was hopeless. Within hours of putting the uniform back on, the lice would be back, either from eggs that survived or from other soldiers or from the environment. The trenches were so infested that you couldn't avoid getting lice again, immediately. The itching was constant and maddening. It wore down men's nerves, adding to the stress and exhaustion. Soldiers couldn't sleep properly because of the itching. They couldn't concentrate. The lice were always there, crawling on you, biting you, a constant reminder of the degrading conditions you were living in. Some soldiers said the lice were worse than the rats because you couldn't get away from them. The rats could be avoided sometimes. The lice were always with you, on you, in your clothes, feeding on you. Lice also spread diseases, including trench fever. Trench fever was caused by a bacteria transmitted by lice bites. Symptoms included high fever, severe pain in the muscles and joints, especially in the legs and back, headaches, and exhaustion. The fever would spike and recede in cycles, lasting weeks or even months. Men with the trench fever were completely incapacitated, unable to fight or work. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were affected by trench fever during the war. It didn't usually kill, but it took men out of action for extended periods, and the suffering was intense. Let's talk about the smell. The trenches stank in ways that are hard to describe. Imagine the worst smell you've ever encountered, the most disgusting thing you've ever smelled, then multiply it by 1,000 and imagine living in it constantly, breathing it with every breath, having it soak into your clothes and hair and skin. The smell came from multiple sources, all combining into an overwhelming stench that defined the trenches as much as the mud and the fear. There were latrines, basically holes dug in the ground where soldiers relieved themselves. In good trenches, these might be somewhat separated from the living areas, maybe in a side trench or behind a traverse. But often, they were just a corner of the trench, a hole in the ground with a plank across it to sit on. The smell of human waste was constant and overpowering. The latrines would overflow when it rained, sewage mixing with the mud and water in the bottom of the trench. Soldiers walked through it, stood in it, sometimes even slept near it because there was nowhere else to go. Then there was the smell of unwashed bodies. Soldiers couldn't bathe for weeks or months at a time. Bathing facilities, when they existed, were far behind the lines. In the frontline trenches, you wore the same clothes day after day after day. You sweated in them. They got soaked with mud and water. They never dried properly. The smell of stale sweat, dirty wool, and unwashed humanity was everywhere. Everyone stank. You got used to your own smell, but the concentration of hundreds or thousands of unwashed men in a confined space created an odor that was thick and almost physical. But the worst smell was the smell of death. No Man's Land was full of corpses, sometimes thousands of them after a major battle. The dead from previous battles would lie there for weeks, months, even years in some cases. These bodies would decompose, creating a sickly sweet smell of rotting flesh that hung over the trenches constantly. In hot weather, the smell was overwhelming, strong enough to make men vomit even if they had grown somewhat accustomed to it. The smell would drift with the wind. Sometimes it would be bearable. Other times, when the wind was wrong, it would be so strong you could taste it. Soldiers tried to get used to it, and many did to some degree, but it was never really normal. Some soldiers said the smell got into everything, into their clothes, their hair, their food. They said they could still smell it years after the war ended, that certain smells would trigger memories, and they'd be right back in the trenches, smelling that awful combination of rot and waste and decay. The smell became associated with the horror of the trenches, a sense memory that veterans couldn't escape. Sometimes bodies would be in the trench walls. As the fighting moved back and forth, dead soldiers would be buried hastily in shallow graves, or simply buried in the trench walls when sections collapsed and were rebuilt. Rain and shelling would expose these bodies. Soldiers would see a hand or a foot sticking out of the trench wall, or worse, a face. Sometimes the exposed bodies would be from recent fighting, still recognizable. Sometimes they were older, decomposed beyond recognition, just bones and rotted uniform. And there was nothing to do about it. You couldn't stop to properly bury every body. You just lived with them, the dead sharing the trenches with the living. Food in the trenches was barely adequate at best and terrible at worst. Supply lines were constantly under threat from artillery fire. Getting food to the frontline trenches was dangerous work, usually done at night to avoid observation by enemy artillery spotters. Rations were basic and boring. British soldiers typically got bully beef, which was canned corned beef that was greasy and tasteless, hard biscuits that were so tough they could break teeth and were often infested with weevils, and tea. The biscuits were so hard that soldiers would sometimes soak them in water or tea to soften them enough to eat. Sometimes soldiers would find creative ways to prepare them, crushing them and mixing them with water to make a kind of paste, or frying them if cooking was possible. Sometimes soldiers got jam, usually plum and apple jam, so much plum and apple jam that they grew to hate it. Sometimes they got cheese. The food was meant to keep men alive, to provide enough calories to function, but not to be enjoyable or nutritious in the way we understand nutrition today. It was often the same thing day after day after day. Bully beef and hard biscuits for breakfast, bully beef and hard biscuits for lunch, bully beef and hard biscuits for dinner. Week after week, month after month. The food was also usually cold because cooking fires would give away positions to enemy artillery, spotters. Smoke from cooking fires could be seen from miles away, so soldiers ate cold bully beef straight out of cans, gnawed on hard biscuits, and drank lukewarm tea if they were lucky enough to have a way to heat water without creating visible smoke. Sometimes small spirit stoves were used, but they were forbidden in frontline positions. The cold food was greasy, congealed, unappetizing, but men ate it because they were hungry. Sometimes food would be contaminated by mud, rat droppings, or worse. Keeping food clean in the trenches was nearly impossible. Men ate it anyway because they were hungry and because there was no alternative. Soldiers lost weight even though they were supposed to be getting adequate calories. The physical demands of trench life, the stress, the lack of sleep, and the constant activity of digging and repairing and carrying supplies, all burned energy faster than the rations could replace it. Men became thin, and their uniforms hanging loose on them. Soldiers were always hungry. Even after eating their rations, they were still hungry. They would eat anything they could scrounge. They would trade with other soldiers. Cigarettes for food, a spare sock for a bit of chocolate. They would beg food from units rotating out of the line. They would try to trap rats to eat, though the rats themselves were so disgusting, most men couldn't bring themselves to do it except in the most desperate circumstances. When soldiers rotated back to rest areas, they would stuff themselves, eating as much as they could, knowing they'd be hungry again soon. Water was even more of a problem than food. Clean water was scarce. Water had to be brought up to the trenches in containers, usually petrol cans or old gasoline containers that gave the water a distinctive taste of petroleum. It was never enough. Men were always thirsty. The water was often contaminated despite efforts to purify it. Chlorination was used, but the amounts were imprecise, and the water would taste strongly of chlorine, making it hard to drink. But you drank it anyway because the alternative was worse. Soldiers would sometimes drink water from shell craters or puddles in the trenches, knowing it was filthy but too thirsty to care. This water was contaminated with everything you can imagine: mud, chemical residue from explosives, human waste, and often the decomposed remains of bodies. Drinking this water led to dysentery and other diseases. Dysentery was a constant problem in the trenches. Men would have severe diarrhea, dehydration, stomach cramps. In severe cases, dysentery could kill, but even in less severe cases, it was debilitating. Imagine having dysentery while in a frontline trench, unable to leave your position. No proper sanitation. It added another layer of misery to an already miserable existence. Proper sanitation was impossible in the trenches. You couldn't wash yourself or your clothes properly. You couldn't dispose of waste properly. You couldn't maintain basic hygiene. Disease spread easily. Besides dysentery and trench fever, there was typhoid, pneumonia, influenza, and various other infections. Medical care was available, but overwhelmed. Field hospitals were always full. Doctors did their best, but they were dealing with conditions and injuries they'd never seen before, with inadequate supplies and primitive understanding of sanitation and infection control. Sleep was difficult to come by, almost a luxury. Soldiers were on constant alert even when not actively fighting. Enemy raids could come at any time. Artillery could start up without warning. You couldn't really relax, and even when there was time to sleep, there was always work to do. Trenches needed to be repaired and reinforced constantly. The rain and shells would destroy sections, and they had to be rebuilt. Sandbags needed to be filled and stacked. Supplies needed to be moved from the rear to the front. Water and ammunition had to be hauled up. Guard duty had to be maintained around the clock, with soldiers taking turns watching no man's land for any sign of enemy activity. At night, patrols went out into no man's land. These patrols had various purposes: repairing barbed wire that had been damaged by artillery, gathering intelligence about enemy positions, trying to capture enemy soldiers for interrogation, or simply making sure the enemy wasn't preparing an attack. These patrols were terrifying. You had to crawl out of the relative safety of the trench and move through no man's land in the darkness, knowing that enemy sentries were watching, knowing that flares could go up at any moment and illuminate you, making you an easy target. Men slept in short shifts, maybe 2 or 3 hours at a time if they were lucky. They slept standing up or sitting in the mud because there was nowhere dry to lie down. Some trenches had small dugouts carved into the trench walls where a man could curl up, but these were in short supply and usually reserved for officers. Most soldiers just propped themselves against the trench wall or slumped in a fire step, a small platform where soldiers stood to fire over the parapet. Exhaustion was constant. Men would fall asleep standing up, even during guard duty, risking punishment but unable to keep their eyes open. The exhaustion wore men down as much as anything else. It dulled their senses, slowed their reactions, made them careless. Exhausted men made mistakes. They would forget to take cover. They would fail to notice danger signs. Exhaustion made men more vulnerable to shell shock, more likely to break under the constant stress. Sleep deprivation was a form of torture, and soldiers endured it for weeks or months at a time. The cold in winter was brutal and life-threatening. Soldiers wore whatever clothes they had, often soaked through from rain or mud. They had thin wool blankets if they were lucky, but blankets were never enough. Wool uniforms were meant to provide some insulation even when wet, but they were still inadequate against the freezing temperatures. At night, temperatures would drop below freezing regularly. Men would huddle together for warmth, pressing against each other, trying to share body heat. Frostbite was common and could be as crippling as any wound. Fingers and toes would go numb first. If you didn't warm them quickly, they would turn white, then blue, then black as the tissue died. Some soldiers lost fingers or toes to frostbite, just as they did to trench foot. Losing digits meant you might be sent home, which seemed like a blessing. But it also meant lifelong disability. The cold sapped energy and made everything harder. Simple tasks became exhausting when your hands were numb and your body was shivering uncontrollably. Handling weapons with frozen fingers was nearly impossible. Loading a rifle or changing a machine gun belt became a struggle. Men tried to keep warm any way they could. They would rub their hands together. They would stamp their feet, though this was discouraged because the movement could be seen by enemy observers. They would huddle in dugouts if available, cramming as many men as possible into a small space to share warmth. They would wrap sandbags or pieces of cloth around themselves, but nothing was really adequate. The cold was relentless, seeping into your bones, making you feel like you would never be warm again. In summer, the heat brought different problems that were equally miserable. The sun beating down on the trenches made them hot and airless. The trenches were below ground level, so there was no breeze. The heat was stifling, oppressive. Men baked in their wool uniforms, sweating profusely and becoming dehydrated. But they couldn't remove their uniforms because that would leave them vulnerable to gas attacks or sudden combat. The wool would hold the sweat, becoming heavy and chafing. The smell of decomposing bodies got much worse in hot weather. The heat accelerated decomposition, making the smell unbearable at times. Flies swarmed everywhere in summer, feeding on corpses and waste, then landing on soldiers' food and faces. The flies were everywhere, thick clouds of them. You couldn't eat without flies landing on your food. You couldn't sleep without flies crawling on you. Soldiers would try to wave them away, but it was pointless. The flies were as unavoidable as the rats and lice. Disease spread more easily in the heat. Food would spoil faster. Water that had been marginally drinkable would become obviously contaminated. Wounds would become infected more quickly. Soldiers would develop heat exhaustion or heat stroke, becoming dizzy and disoriented. The summer heat made the trenches feel like ovens, baking the men inside, adding another layer of misery to an already unbearable existence. But the physical discomfort, as terrible as it was, as degrading and debilitating as it was, wasn't even the worst part of a trench life. The worst part was the fear. Constant, unrelenting, soul-crushing fear. Because at any moment, without warning, without any chance to prepare or protect yourself, death could come. And there was nothing you could do about it. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't hide from it. You could only wait and hope that this moment, this hour, this day wouldn't be your last. Artillery bombardments were the most terrifying experience for most soldiers, worse than any other aspect of trench warfare. The vast majority of casualties in World War I came from artillery fire, not from rifles or machine guns or bayonets. Artillery shells could be fired from miles away, from guns you couldn't see. You couldn't see who was trying to kill you. You couldn't fight back. You couldn't shoot at the enemy artillery because it was too far away, hidden behind hills or forests. You could only huddle in the trench and hope that a shell didn't land directly on you or close enough to kill you with shrapnel or concussion. The bombardments would start suddenly, without warning. You might be eating or sleeping or talking to a friend. Then, suddenly, there would be a whistling sound as shells came down. The whistling varied depending on the size and type of shell and how close it was. Soldiers learned to estimate where shells would land by the sound. A high-pitched whistle meant the shell would land far away. A lower, louder whistle meant it was close. And if you heard a very loud, rushing sound, that meant the shell was going to land right on top of you, and it was already too late to do anything about it. Then came the explosion. A huge blast that would throw dirt, debris, sandbags, pieces of trench, and body parts into the air. The concussion would hit you like a physical blow, a wall of pressure that could knock you down, knock the breath out of you, make your ears ring so loud you couldn't hear anything else. If the shell landed close enough, the shockwave could kill you even if you weren't hit by shrapnel. It could rupture your organs, burst your lungs, cause internal bleeding that would kill you slowly. It could kill you without leaving a visible mark on your body, and other soldiers would find you looking normal, except you were dead. Shrapnel from shells was deadly. When a shell exploded, the metal casing would fragment into thousands of pieces of hot metal flying in all directions at incredible speed. Shrapnel could tear through sandbags, wood, even thin metal. It could tear through human bodies easily. Men would be cut to pieces by shrapnel, limbs severed, bodies torn open, heads split apart. A single shell landing in the wrong place could kill or wound dozens of men at once. And there was no pattern to it, no way to predict who would be hit. Two men standing next to each other, one would be killed instantly, and the other would be completely unharmed. It was pure chance, pure luck, whether you lived or died. Bombardments could last for hours or even days without stopping. The Germans bombarded Verdun for over a week straight before launching their infantry attack. During the preliminary bombardment for the Battle of the Somme, British and French artillery fired over 1 million shells in 1 week. Imagine being under that constant barrage. The ground shaking continuously. The noise so loud it overwhelms all your senses. So loud you can't think, can't communicate, can barely stay conscious. Shells landing constantly, randomly, some close enough to shake your bones, others farther away but close enough that you can feel the concussion and hear the shrapnel whizzing overhead. You don't know if the next shell will land on top of you. You don't know if you'll be alive in 1 minute, 5 minutes, an hour. There's nothing you can do except wait. Some men would go mad during bombardments. The fear and stress and noise would break them. They would start screaming, crying, babbling. They would try to run, even though there was nowhere to go, even though running would just expose them to more danger. Other men would just sit in silence, staring at nothing, shaking uncontrollably, waiting for it to end or for death to come, whichever came first. Some men prayed, some cursed, some just endured, their minds going somewhere else, dissociating from their bodies to escape the unbearable reality. The shells would destroy trenches, collapsing sections, and burying men alive. Being buried alive was one of the worst fates a soldier could face. You would be trapped under dirt and debris, unable to move, unable to breathe, slowly suffocating. If you were lucky, you would lose consciousness quickly. If you weren't lucky, you would be aware for minutes as you died. Soldiers would have to dig out their comrades after bombardments, frantically trying to reach men who were buried. Sometimes they would find them still alive but injured or in shock. Sometimes they would find them dead, suffocated or crushed. And sometimes they would never find them at all, the bodies lost forever in the mud and debris. The smell after a bombardment was distinct and awful. Explosives created a sharp, acrid smell. Mixed with the smell of blood and death and torn earth, it created an odor that was uniquely associated with warfare. Soldiers who survived bombardments described how the smell would linger, how they could taste the explosives and blood in the air, and survivors would have to rebuild their trenches immediately, often while still under sniper fire or the threat of another bombardment starting. They would fill sandbags, stack them back up, shore up collapsed sections, remove the debris and the bodies, and prepare for the next attack. Then there was gas. Poison gas was introduced by Germany in April 1915 at the Second Battle of Ypres and was soon used by all sides. It was a weapon that terrified soldiers more than almost anything else because it was invisible and insidious. Several types of gas were used during the war, each with different effects, all of them horrible. Chlorine gas was one of the first. It was a greenish-yellow gas that was heavier than air, so it would flow along the ground and sink into trenches. Chlorine would burn your lungs and throat, causing you to cough and choke. You would cough up blood and mucus as your lungs were destroyed. You would struggle to breathe, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Death from chlorine gas took minutes to hours, depending on the concentration. You would drown in your own fluids as your lungs filled. It was a terrible way to die, conscious and aware the whole time, fighting for every breath. Phosgene was even more deadly than chlorine. It was harder to detect because it didn't have as strong a smell. It smelled like freshly cut grass or hay, which didn't immediately alarm soldiers. But phosgene was more toxic. It would cause your lungs to fill with fluid, essentially drowning you in your own body fluids. Death could take up to 48 hours, 2 days of slowly suffocating, unable to breathe properly, coughing and gasping, and there was no real treatment. Doctors could only make patients comfortable and hope they survived. Mustard gas, introduced later in the war, was the worst in many ways. It wouldn't necessarily kill you immediately, but it would destroy your quality of life forever. Mustard gas was an oily liquid that vaporized. It would settle on your skin, your clothes, your equipment. At first, you might not even know you'd been exposed, but within hours, your skin would start to burn and blister. Huge, painful blisters would form all over your body, especially in warm, moist areas like armpits and groin. The blisters would pop and become infected. Your eyes would burn and swell shut, often causing temporary or permanent blindness. The gas would destroy your lungs over time, causing chronic respiratory problems. Men who survived mustard gas attacks often lived for years or decades in agony, their lungs destroyed, their skin scarred, their eyes ruined, in constant pain. When gas was released, or when shells carrying gas exploded, soldiers would scramble to put on gas masks. Early gas masks were crude and uncomfortable, basically cloth bags soaked in chemicals, with glass eyepieces and a filter. They were difficult to breathe through and would fog up, limiting vision. Later, masks were better, with rubber facepieces and charcoal filters, but they were still uncomfortable and claustrophobic. The mask had to form a perfect seal around your face. If you had a beard, the mask wouldn't seal properly and gas could get in. If the mask was damaged, or if the filter was saturated, you were in danger. If you couldn't get your mask on in time, you were dead or critically injured. Men would panic when they saw gas coming, or when the gas alarm was sounded. The alarm was usually a bell or empty shell casing being struck rapidly. When you heard that sound, you had seconds to get your mask on. Fumbling with the mask while gas was around you, trying to get it on properly while your lungs were already burning, was terrifying. And if your mask failed, if you inhaled gas, you knew you were probably going to die slowly and painfully, or, if you survived, you would be disabled for life. Gas masks made it hard to see, hard to hear, hard to breathe, hard to communicate. Soldiers wearing masks were vulnerable, slower to react, disoriented. But wearing the mask was better than the alternative. Gas attacks created chaos and terror. Men couldn't tell if the gas was still present because some gases were colorless and odorless once dispersed. You didn't know how long to keep your mask on. Keeping it on too long was exhausting and made you vulnerable to other threats. Taking it off too soon could be fatal. Gas settled in trenches and shell craters because it was heavier than air. It would flow into low areas and stay there. Soldiers couldn't see it always. Some gases were invisible once they dispersed. You would walk into a pocket of gas and not realize it until you started coughing and your eyes started burning. Gas attacks made large areas of the battlefield temporarily uninhabitable. Even after the gas dispersed, it could linger on surfaces, in clothing, in equipment, continuing to cause casualties hours or days later. And then there were the attacks over the top, the times when soldiers had to leave the trenches and assault enemy positions. This was what soldiers feared most. Even more than bombardments or gas in many cases. The order to attack meant leaving the relative safety of the trench and running across open ground toward enemy positions while being shot at by machine guns and artillery. It meant almost certain death or injury for many of the men going over the top. No man's land was the area between the opposing trenches, usually between 50 and 300 yards wide, though in some places it was narrower and in others much wider. This ground was covered with obstacles designed to slow attackers and make them easy targets. There was barbed wire, thick entanglements of it, multiple rows stretching across the entire front. The wire was strong, with sharp barbs that would catch on clothing and equipment. It was staked into the ground and strung between posts. Some wire barriers were 10 or 15 yards deep, a maze of steel that was nearly impossible to get through quickly. Artillery bombardments before attacks were supposed to destroy the wire, cutting it up so infantry could pass through. But artillery was often ineffective against wire. Shells would explode and throw up geysers of dirt, but the wire would often survive intact or would be tossed around and tangled even worse than before. Wire cutters were issued to soldiers to cut through wire manually, but this was slow, dangerous work. A man cutting wire was standing still, making himself an easy target, and while he was cutting, His comrades behind him were bunching up, waiting to get through, also making easy targets. The ground in no man's land was torn up by shells, pockmarked with craters that would fill with water and mud. These craters could be deep enough to drown in. The water at the bottom was contaminated with everything imaginable: chemicals from explosives, human waste, blood, decomposed tissue from bodies. Men would fall into these craters while running and get stuck in the mud at the bottom, sinking into the mire while trying to climb out. Some would drown in shell craters, pulled under by the weight of their equipment, unable to escape the sucking mud. The ground was uneven, treacherous, covered with debris. There were pieces of equipment, shell fragments, discarded weapons, dead bodies in various states of decomposition. Running across this terrain while carrying 60 or 70 pounds of equipment and being shot at was nearly impossible. Men would trip and fall. They would stumble into craters. They would get caught in wire. And all the while, machine guns and rifles were firing at them. Machine guns were the attacker's worst enemy, the weapon that made frontal assault so deadly. A single machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute. That's 10 bullets every second, a continuous stream of lead. A well-positioned machine gun with good fields of fire and adequate ammunition could stop an entire battalion. Machine gunners would traverse their fire back and forth across no man's land, cutting down men in swaths. The sound of machine gun fire was distinctive, a rapid chattering that struck terror into attacking soldiers. Machine gun fire would cut down men by the dozens, by the hundreds, by the thousands. Officers leading attacks with swords or pistols, trying to inspire their men by personal example, would be killed immediately because they made obvious targets. The officers often went first, climbing out of the trench ahead of their men, blowing whistles and waving their men forward. They would be shot down within seconds. Their bodies would fall back into the trench or would hang on the parapet, and other men would have to climb past them to continue the attack. Men would fall in waves, like wheat being cut by a scythe. One moment a man would be running forward, and the next he would be on the ground, shot through the heart or head or lungs. Some men were killed instantly. Others were wounded and would lie in no man's land crying out for help that often couldn't come. Retrieving wounded from no man's land during an attack was nearly impossible. Stretcher bearers who tried were often killed or wounded themselves. So wounded men would lie there, sometimes for hours or days, slowly dying from their injuries, from exposure, from thirst, calling out for help that never came. Those who made it through the machine gun fire, and not many did, would reach the enemy trenches if they were lucky. By that point, they would be exhausted from running, from the fear, from carrying heavy equipment across difficult ground. They would arrive in small groups, disorganized, separated from their units. The neat formations they had started in would be torn apart. Officers would be dead or wounded. Non-commissioned officers would try to take command, but communication was nearly impossible in the chaos of battle. Reaching the enemy trench meant close-quarters fighting. Jumping down into a trench full of enemy soldiers, fighting with rifles, bayonets, grenades, clubs, knives, fists, whatever you had. It was brutal, savage combat. Men would bayonet each other. They would throw grenades into dugouts. They would shoot at point-blank range. It was kill or be killed, with no mercy given or asked. The violence was primal and horrifying. And even if you captured an enemy trench, your problems weren't over. You had to hold it against counterattacks. The enemy would bring up reinforcements and try to retake the position. Artillery from both sides would bombard the captured trench. You would be cut off from your own lines, running low on ammunition, surrounded by dead and wounded, exhausted, and facing fresh enemy troops trying to push you back out. More often than not, attacks would fail completely. Men would get cut down in no man's land and never reach the enemy trenches at all. Survivors would retreat back to their own trenches, leaving the dead and wounded behind. And the next day or the next week, they might be ordered to attack again, to try to take the same ground again, stepping over the bodies of their comrades from the previous attack. The casualties from these attacks were horrific beyond comprehension. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, British forces took nearly 60,000 casualties, with almost 20,000 killed. Most died in the first hour of the attack. Between 7:30 and 8:30 a.m., men climbed out of their trenches and walked toward the German lines. They had been ordered to walk, not run, in neat lines, because commanders thought the week-long preliminary bombardment had destroyed German defenses and killed most of the defenders. It hadn't. German machine gunners had survived in deep bunkers. When the bombardment stopped and British soldiers went over the top, the Germans came out of their bunkers, set up their machine guns, and opened fire. British soldiers fell in rows, cut down like grass. Some units lost over 90% of their men in the first few minutes. Entire battalions were destroyed. The Newfoundland Regiment lost 684 men out of 780 in less than half an hour. The 10th Battalion of the West Yorkshire Regiment lost 710 men out of 800. These weren't just numbers. These were individuals, men with names and families and lives. Each one who died was a son, a brother, a husband, a father. Each death was a tragedy that rippled out to affect families and communities. And this happened not just on the Somme, but in countless attacks throughout the war. Verdun, Passchendaele, the Aisne, the Marne, all of these battles saw similar slaughter. Hundreds of thousands of men sent forward to attack positions that couldn't be taken, dying by the thousands for gains measured in yards, gains that would often be lost in the next counterattack. It was slaughter on an industrial scale, a waste of human life that defied comprehension. Soldiers knew the attacks would probably kill them. They weren't stupid. They could see the wire. They could see the machine gun positions. They understood the odds. Many soldiers knew they wouldn't survive. They would write letters to their families before an attack, final letters to be sent if they died. They would give personal belongings to friends for safekeeping. They would say goodbye, not expecting to see each other again. They knew they were being sent to their deaths, but they had to obey orders. Refusing to go over the top meant being shot for cowardice. Military law in all armies allowed for execution of soldiers who refused to fight, and executions did happen. British and French military courts sentenced hundreds of soldiers to death for cowardice, desertion, or mutiny. The men would be shot by firing squad, usually composed of soldiers from their own unit, men who had fought alongside them. It was meant to serve as an example, to terrify others into obedience. The threat of execution kept men going forward even when they knew they were walking to their deaths. So they went. They climbed the ladders out of the trenches, went over the parapet, and ran toward the enemy knowing they would probably die. The courage this required is almost impossible to comprehend. These weren't professional soldiers eager for glory, though there were some of those. And these were mostly conscripts, ordinary men who had been farmers, clerks, teachers, workers before the war. They were terrified. But they went anyway because that's what was expected of them, because their comrades were going, because refusing meant certain death by firing squad while going forward at least gave them a small chance of survival. Some men broke under the strain. They couldn't take it anymore. The constant fear, the horrible conditions, the deaths of friends, the bombardments, the gas, the attacks, the unending misery, their minds would snap. This was called shell shock at the time. We would call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder today. But whatever you called it, the symptoms were real and devastating. Men with shell shock would develop various symptoms. Some would shake uncontrollably, a tremor that wouldn't stop. Their hands would shake so badly they couldn't hold a rifle or a cup, and their whole bodies would tremble. Some couldn't speak, losing the ability to talk, either from psychological trauma or from the physical effects of being near so many explosions. Some would stare blankly, unresponsive to what was happening around them, retreating into themselves. Some would scream and cry uncontrollably. Some would have violent outbursts, attacking others or themselves. Some would refuse to fight, sitting down and refusing to move, unable to make themselves go forward no matter what threats were made. Some would try to run away, deserting their posts, trying to escape the horror even though there was nowhere to go. Some would become convinced they were going to die and would act accordingly, giving away possessions, saying goodbye to everyone, becoming fatalistic and reckless. Some would develop physical symptoms with no physical cause: blindness, deafness, paralysis, all psychosomatic but real to the men experiencing them. The military didn't understand shell shock at first. They thought men were faking it or were cowards. Early in the war, men with shell shock were sometimes shot for cowardice or desertion. They were accused of malingering, of pretending to be ill to avoid fighting. Officers would threaten them, yell at them to snap out of it, to be a man, to do their duty. But shell shock was real. It was a psychological breakdown caused by unbearable stress and trauma. You can only take so much fear and horror before your mind breaks to protect itself. As the war went on and thousands of men developed shell shock, it was recognized as a real medical condition, but treatment was still primitive and often cruel. Some doctors tried electric shock therapy, applying electrical current to patients to shock them out of their symptoms. The theory was that the fear of the painful shocks would motivate men to recover. It didn't work and was essentially torture. Some doctors used isolation, putting shell shock patients in solitary confinement to force them to confront their fears. Some used confrontation therapy, shouting at patients, berating them, trying to shame them into recovering. Some tried rest and quiet, removing patients from the front lines and giving them time to recover in peaceful environments. This last approach was most effective, but it was seen as coddling and was often not provided. Many men never recovered from shell shock. They spent the rest of their lives in mental institutions, unable to function in normal society, unable to escape the mental prison the war had created. Others recovered partially but carried the scars forever. They would have nightmares for the rest of their lives, violent dreams where they were back in the trenches, back under bombardment, watching their friends die. They would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, unable to distinguish dream from reality for several terrifying moments. The psychological toll of trench warfare on even those who didn't develop clinical shell shock was enormous. Every soldier was affected by what they experienced. Soldiers developed a fatalistic attitude toward life and death. They stopped thinking about the future because they didn't believe they had one. Tomorrow was uncertain. Next week was unimaginable. They lived day by day, hour by hour, moment by moment. Planning for the future seemed pointless when you might be dead in an hour. They stopped feeling emotions as strongly because feeling meant pain. You couldn't grieve every death because there were too many deaths. If you cried for every friend who died, you would do nothing but cry. So you became numb. You built walls around your emotions. You stopped letting yourself care as deeply. A man you were talking to in the morning could be dead by afternoon, blown apart by a shell or shot by a sniper. After a while, you stopped caring as much. You had to, or you'd go insane. You would acknowledge the death, feel a brief moment of sadness, and then move on because there was too much else to worry about, and because you might be next. Soldiers formed incredibly strong bonds with their comrades, stronger than any bonds they had with people back home. Your fellow soldiers were the only people who understood what you were going through. They were living the same nightmare. You depended on each other absolutely. The man next to you in the trench might save your life tomorrow. You might save his. You shared food, water, cigarettes, whatever you had. You took care of each other. You covered for each other. You would risk your life for your comrades because they would do the same for you. These bonds transcended everything else. Men from different social classes, different regions, different backgrounds. Men who would never have associated in civilian life became brothers in the trenches. The shared suffering and danger created a connection that was deeper than almost anything else in human experience. Veterans would say that the friendships they formed in the trenches were the strongest friendships of their lives, stronger than marriages, stronger than family bonds, because your trenchmates understood you in a way no one else ever could. When comrades died, men grieved intensely but briefly. You couldn't dwell on it. There was too much else to worry about. More friends would die tomorrow. If you grieved fully for each loss, you would be crippled by grief. So you learned to grieve quickly and move on. You would feel the loss, acknowledge it, maybe say a few words if there was time, and then you would continue with whatever you were doing because the war didn't stop for your grief. Some soldiers would carry tokens from dead friends, a watch or a photograph or a letter, small reminders of the men they had lost. But they couldn't dwell on the losses or they would be overwhelmed. Letters from home were precious, a lifeline to the world outside the trenches. They were a connection to normal life, a reminder that there was a world beyond the mud and the fear, beyond the constant threat of death. Soldiers would read letters from wives, mothers, girlfriends, siblings over and over, memorizing every word. They would keep letters in their pockets, close to their hearts, literally. The paper would become worn and dirty from being read so many times, but soldiers would carefully preserve these letters because they were precious. But letters also reminded soldiers of what they were missing, what they might never see again. Reading about home, about normal things like family dinners or children playing or the harvest or daily life, emphasized how far away they were from all of that. Some soldiers found letters more painful than comforting because they emphasized the gap between the hell of the trenches and the normal world they had left behind. How could they explain to people at home what they were experiencing? How could their families possibly understand? The disconnect was painful. Some soldiers stopped writing letters or reading letters from home because it was too hard to maintain that connection to a world that seemed unreal. Leave, when soldiers got it, was both wonderful and strange. After weeks or months in the trenches, soldiers would be rotated back to rest areas behind the lines. These rest areas were safer, though never completely safe, because they could still be hit by long-range artillery. But they were away from the frontline trenches, away from the constant immediate danger. Soldiers could sleep in real beds, or at least in dry barracks. They could wash themselves and their clothes. They could eat better food. They could rest and try to recover some of their strength. Occasionally, soldiers would get longer leaves, passes that allowed them to travel back to Britain or to Paris or to other cities where they could be away from the war entirely for a few days or a week. These leaves were supposed to be a break, a chance to rest and recover. And in some ways they were wonderful, to sleep in a real bed, to eat a good meal, to walk down a street without fear of shells or bullets, to see women and children and normal civilian life It was like entering another world. But many soldiers found that they couldn't relate to people at home anymore. Civilians didn't understand what the soldiers had been through. They couldn't understand. How could they? They hadn't been there. They would ask questions that revealed their ignorance. What's it like over there? Have you killed anyone? Is it exciting? These questions, asked innocently, would anger soldiers who had seen things no human should see. How do you explain to someone who's never been in combat what it's like to watch your friend die screaming? How do you explain the fear, the filth, the degradation? Civilians would complain about trivial problems, about rationing or shortages or inconveniences, and soldiers would find themselves angry, thinking about how these people had no idea what real suffering was. They had clean clothes and warm beds and enough food. They weren't standing in mud full of corpses. They weren't being shelled. They weren't watching people die. Their problems seemed absurd, laughably insignificant compared to what soldiers were dealing with. And soldiers couldn't explain what they had experienced. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you make someone understand who hasn't been there? Words failed. You couldn't convey the reality of it. If you tried, if you talked about the horrible things you'd seen, people would be shocked and uncomfortable. They didn't want to hear it. They wanted to hear about heroism and bravery, not about mud and rats and fear. So soldiers would stop trying to explain. They would give vague answers or change the subject. The gap between their experience and civilians' understanding was unbridgeable. Many soldiers felt more comfortable with their fellow soldiers than with their own families during leave. With other soldiers, you didn't have to explain. They knew. You could talk about the war, or you could not talk about it, and either way, they understood. With family, there was constant awkwardness, constant misunderstanding. Your wife or mother would try to be supportive, but wouldn't understand. They would say the wrong things. The conversations would be stilted and uncomfortable. Soldiers would find themselves counting the days until their leave ended and they could return to the front. Not because they wanted to be back in the trenches, but because at least there, things made sense. Some soldiers found that they actually missed the trenches when they were on leave. Not the horror and the fear, but the simplicity of it. In the trenches, life was simple. Stay alive. Take care of your comrades. Do your duty. There were no complex decisions, no ambiguity. Everything was reduced to basics. And there was the bond with other soldiers, the sense of shared purpose and shared suffering, the knowledge that you were part of something bigger than yourself, even if that something was terrible. Back home on leave, life was complicated. You had to pretend to be normal. You had to participate in normal conversations about normal things. You had to care about things that seemed meaningless. Your wife wanted to talk about redecorating or about a neighbor's gossip. Your mother wanted to talk about family news. Your friends wanted to hear war stories, but only the exciting parts, not the truth. You had to pretend that you were the same person you were before the war, but you weren't. You were changed fundamentally, and you couldn't go back to who you had been. So some soldiers found themselves relieved when their leave ended and they could return to the front, back to where life made sense in its own terrible way. Back to where you were with people who understood. Back to where you didn't have to pretend or explain. It was a strange paradox, missing the hell of the trenches, but it was a real feeling that many soldiers experienced. The longer the war went on, the more the trenches became permanent features of the landscape. What had started as temporary positions, holes dug quickly for immediate protection, became elaborate systems that were maintained and improved for years. The Germans, who were often fighting defensively and had no intention of giving up the territory they held, built extensive trench networks with concrete bunkers, elaborate drainage systems, even underground living quarters that were almost comfortable. Some German trenches had electricity, generated by small engines, providing light for underground bunkers. They had running water piped in from wells, and they had comfortable accommodations deep underground where officers and senior enlisted men could sleep safely, protected from all but the heaviest shells. German soldiers called these deep bunkers homes, and would decorate them with furniture looted from nearby towns that had been evacuated. They would hang pictures on walls, have chairs and tables, make them as livable as possible. Some German bunkers were 30 or 40 feet underground, with multiple levels, elaborate tunnel systems connecting them, almost like underground cities. Allied trenches were generally less elaborate, partly because the Allies were nominally on the offensive and didn't want to make trenches too comfortable. British and French commanders worried that if trenches were too comfortable, soldiers would lose their aggressive spirit and wouldn't want to attack. So Allied trenches remained more primitive. But even Allied trenches became more developed over time as the war dragged on, and it became clear that the trench systems would be there for a long time. Soldiers would try to improve their living conditions in small ways, doing what they could to make life slightly more bearable. They would dig small shelters into the trench walls, carved out spaces just big enough for a man to curl up in, getting them out of the bottom of the trench where the water and mud were. These were called funk holes. They would scrounge materials to make crude furniture, a plank to sit on, a box to store belongings. They would try to create small amounts of personal space in an environment where privacy was impossible. Behind the frontline trenches, in rest areas and support positions, soldiers could sometimes find moments of normalcy, or at least approaches to normalcy. They would play cards, gambling for cigarettes or small amounts of money. They would write letters home, though what they wrote was censored by officers and they couldn't describe the reality of their situation. They would read books or magazines sent from home or provided by military welfare organizations. They would talk, telling stories about home, about their lives before the war, about what they wanted to do when the war ended, if they survived. Some units organized entertainment when possible. There would be concerts with soldiers who had musical talent performing for their comrades. Some men brought instruments from home or improvised instruments. Music was precious in the trenches, a reminder of civilization and beauty in the midst of horror. There would be sports competitions when units were in rest areas, football matches or boxing matches or other athletic events. Officers would try to maintain morale by giving soldiers things to do besides worry about the next battle, activities that provided distraction and purpose. Religion became very important to many soldiers. Faced with constant death and the real possibility that they would die at any moment, many men turned to faith for comfort and meaning. Chaplains were valued members of military units. They would hold religious services when possible, providing a sense of structure and continuity. They would provide counseling to men struggling with fear, or guilt, or grief. They would administer last rites to dying men, providing comfort in final moments. They would write letters to families of men who had died, trying to provide some comfort and closure. Even soldiers who hadn't been particularly religious before the war often became so in the trenches. Prayer gave men something to hold on to, some sense that there was meaning in the madness, some structure to organize their thoughts and fears around. The rituals of religion, the familiar prayers and hymns, provided comfort through their familiarity. They were a connection to the world before the war, to home, to normalcy. And religion provided hope that if they died, it wasn't the end, that there was something beyond death, that their suffering had meaning in a larger cosmic sense. Others lost their faith entirely. How could a just God allow this? How could there be any divine plan that included the senseless slaughter of millions? How could God be loving or merciful when innocent men were being torn apart by machine guns and shells? Some soldiers became bitter atheists, believing that the war proved there was no God, or, if there was, he had abandoned them. They felt that any God who would allow such suffering didn't deserve worship. The war challenged beliefs and broke men spiritually as well as physically and mentally. Soldiers developed dark humor as a coping mechanism. They would joke about death, about the terrible conditions, about their officers, about the enemy. The jokes were often morbid, the kind that would horrify civilians. Jokes about being killed, about the rats eating their bodies, about how the only way out of the trenches was death, or a serious enough wound to get you evacuated. Black humor, gallows humor, finding laughter in the darkest places because if you couldn't laugh, you would cry or go mad. So soldiers laughed at things that weren't funny, found absurdity in the nightmare around them, made jokes about the probability of dying. It was a way to take back some small measure of control, to show that the war hadn't completely defeated their spirits. If you could laugh at death, if you could make a joke while standing in filthy water surrounded by rats, if you could find humor in the absurdity of military bureaucracy or the incompetence of officers, you were asserting that you were still human, still capable of finding lightness even in the darkest circumstances. There were occasional moments of humanity, even in the midst of horror, brief instances when the recognition of shared humanity overcame the imperative to kill. The Christmas truce of 1914 is the most famous example. On Christmas Day 1914, in various sectors along the Western Front, British and German soldiers stopped fighting. In some places, soldiers put up Christmas trees and sang carols. Soldiers from both sides ventured into no man's land, meeting in the middle, shaking hands, exchanging small gifts like cigarettes or chocolate or buttons from their uniforms as souvenirs. In some sectors, soldiers played football in no man's land, impromptu matches using whatever could serve as a ball. It was a spontaneous moment of peace in the middle of war, a recognition that the men on both sides were human beings, not monsters, that they were all caught in the same nightmare. For a few hours, on Christmas Day, enemies became fellow humans sharing a moment of peace and celebration. Some soldiers exchanged addresses and promised to meet after the war, though most would never see each other again. But the truce couldn't last. The next day, they went back to trying to kill each other. Orders came from high commands on both sides forbidding any repetition of the Christmas truce. Officers who had allowed it were reprimanded or transferred. Artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas Day in subsequent years to prevent any similar outbreaks of peace. The high commands understood that if soldiers on both sides started seeing each other as human beings, they might refuse to fight. The war required dehumanization of the enemy. Moments of humanity threatened that. But there were smaller moments throughout the war, informal truces that happened spontaneously. Sometimes opposing soldiers would have unspoken agreements not to shoot during certain times, like meal times or when it rained heavily. Sometimes they would refrain from shooting at men who were clearly just trying to get water or relieve themselves, recognizing that these were human needs that transcended the war. Sometimes soldiers on both sides would recognize that the men facing them were just like them, ordinary men caught in an extraordinary nightmare, following orders, trying to survive. But these moments were rare and fragile. Most of the time, it was kill or be killed. Most of the time, you couldn't afford to think of the enemy as human because you might have to shoot him tomorrow. Dehumanization was a survival mechanism. If you thought of enemy soldiers as people with families and lives and dreams, it would be harder to kill them. So you called them Hans or Box or Jerry or Fritz, reducing them to labels, making them less than human, making it easier to do what you had to do. The war changed men fundamentally and permanently. Soldiers who survived and eventually went home were not the same people who had left. How could they be? They had seen and done things that no human should see or do. They had watched friends die in horrible ways. They'd killed other human beings, looked into their eyes as they died. They had lived in conditions of unimaginable filth and discomfort for months or years. They had been afraid for so long that fear had become their normal state, so that when the fear ended, they didn't know how to feel. They had been numbed to death and suffering, had built walls around their emotions to survive. These experiences marked them permanently, scarred them in ways that never fully healed. Many veterans struggled for the rest of their lives with what they had experienced, with what they had become. Subscribe to remember their sacrifice.